Sometimes, history does not take centuries to change. Sometimes, it does not take years, or even days. Sometimes as a broken bar it takes only minutes. 135 minutes. From 6:45 a.m. to 9 o'clock a.m., Africa witnessed a moment that would forever alter its destiny. Today, we take you back to those powerful 135 minutes as a broken bar and show you how they changed the course of African history forever. Scene 1: A early morning silence. The camera opens to a quiet African city. The streets are calm, people are going about their lives, vendors are setting up stalls, school children are preparing for the day, and office workers rush to catch taxis. But at exactly 6:45 a.m., something happens. Narrator: At this moment, the sun had barely risen. But in the capital city, a group of men and women were already awake, here planning, waiting, and preparing for something that would shake not only Africa, but the entire world. Scene 2: As the meeting begins. Inside the guarded room, African leaders, military generals, economists, and youth representatives gather around a large wooden table. The clock strikes 6:45 a.m. Narrator: For decades, Africa had been under pressure of foreign banks controlling its currency, corporations draining its resources, and politicians bowing to outside powers. But on this morning, for the first time in modern history, African leaders from different nations sat down together with one goal: to declare real independence. Scene 3: At the secret document. A folder is placed on the table. Inside it, a historic declaration. It outlines the creation of a united African monetary system, the cancellation of colonial era debts, and a new agreement to trade Africa's natural resources only in African currencies. Narrator: The plan was bold. Too bold, some said, but everyone in that room knew, if they failed today, Africa would remain a servant to outside powers. But if they succeeded, the broken bar, the continent would rise as never before. Scene 4: At the debate. The leaders argue passionately. One minister fears foreign retaliation, another worries about assassinations. A general insists that Africa has enough strength to defend itself. A young activist reminds them of the suffering of ordinary Africans. Narrator: Voices clashed. Some wanted caution, others demanded immediate action. And while they debated, the minutes kept ticking away. Scene 5: At the turning point. At 7:30 a.m., the room grows silent. One of the senior leaders stands up. He slams his fist on the table and declares, "Leader," dramatic voice, "if we keep waiting, Africa will never be free. We either act today a broken bar or we die as slaves." The room falls into stunned silence. Then, one by one, every leader signs the document. Narrator: And just like that, at 7:42 a.m., the future of Africa began to shift. Scene 6: At the broadcast. By 8 o'clock a.m., a live broadcast is prepared. Across Africa, millions of people gather around radios, TVs, and mobile phones. Narrator: For the first time, Africans were about to hear a message not written in Washington, not dictated from Paris, not influenced by London, but crafted in Africa, by Africans, for Africans. A leader steps to the microphone. "Leader, calm but firm, brothers and sisters of Africa. Today, we declare that Africa will no longer beg. Africa will no longer kneel. From this day forward, we will trade in our own currency, protect our own resources, and write our own destiny." The crowd outside erupts in cheers. Scene 7: International shockwaves. By 8:15 a.m., the news spreads across the world. International stock markets react violently. Oil prices fluctuate. Western media calls it reckless and dangerous. But in Africa, people dance in the streets. Narrator: The world could not believe what was happening. In just 90 minutes, Africa had declared economic freedom. But this was not the end. The hardest minutes were still ahead. Scene 8: At the threats. By 8:30 a.m., phone calls begin flooding in. Western leaders threaten sanctions. Corporations warn they will pull out investments. Foreign banks declare the move illegal. Inside the African meeting room, pressure mounts. Narrator: The threats came fast and hard. But the African leaders had prepared for this. They knew the price of freedom would not be cheap. Scene 9: At the final vote. At 8:45 a.m., The leaders take a final vote should they move forward, or back down. The tension is unbearable. Finally, the vote is counted. Narrator: it was unanimous. Every single leader voted yes. Africa was free. Scene 10 at the 9:00 a.m. moment. The clock strikes 9:00 a.m. The declaration is signed, sealed, and broadcast worldwide. The 135 minutes are complete. Narrator: powerful voice. From 6:45 a.m. to 9:00 am. A broken bar. Just 135 minutes as a broken bar. Africa took back its dignity. For the first time in centuries, the continent declared not only political independence, but economic and spiritual freedom. Scene 11a Aftermath Legacy. But the story does not end there. Narrator: what followed was not easy. There were sanctions, blockades, and attempts to divide the nations once again. But Africa stood firm. Because once the people had tasted freedom, there was no turning back. Over the next years, Africa launched its own digital currency. Pan-African universities flourished. Young entrepreneurs created new industries. And for the first time, African children grew up knowing they were not beggars, but leaders of a new world. Closing scene. The screen shows the African sunrise. Narrator: emotional voice. History is not always written in centuries. Sometimes, it is written in minutes. From 6:45 a.m. to 9:00 am. 135 minutes that changed African history forever. Fade to black. Scene 12 as the world reacts. The morning after, international newspapers screamed with headlines: Africa declares financial independence. Markets in turmoil after bold African move. The end of colonial control. Narrator: the world was shaken. For over a century, Africa's wealth had been drained. Gold, diamonds, oil, cocoa, and rare minerals are all flowing outward, while its people remain poor. But in one historic morning, Africa declared, no more. Scene 13 as the sanctions begin. By the end of the week, foreign governments announce sanctions. African leaders are blacklisted. International banks freeze African assets. Shipping companies are pressured not to deliver goods. Narrator: they thought Africa would collapse any weeks. They thought hunger, chaos, and division would force the leaders to surrender. But they underestimated something powerful: the unity of the African people. Scene 14 as the people rise. Across villages, towns, and cities, ordinary Africans step up. Farmers begin growing food locally instead of depending on imports. Mechanics rebuild broken machines with local parts. Teachers volunteer to teach without pay to keep schools open. Narrator: what the world saw as a weakness, a broken bar, Africa turned into strength. When the outside world tried to choke Africa, Africans discovered their own lungs. Scene 15 at a youth movement. At universities, students rally. A young woman speaks to a massive crowd. Student leader: they can freeze our banks, but they cannot freeze our minds. They can block our ports, but they cannot block our future. We are the generation that will finish what our ancestors started. The crowd erupts into chants of Africa, Africa, Africa. Narrator: it was no longer just about leaders in suits or generals in uniforms. The youth had taken ownership of the dream. Scene 16a a new currency is born. Months later, Africa unveils its first Pan-African digital currency backed not by foreign banks, but by Africa's gold, oil, and rare minerals. Narrator: the world laughed at first. But when trade began flowing in this new currency, when African nations began to prosper without outside permission, the laughter stopped. Scene 17 8 enemies within. But not everyone is happy. Some African elites, who once profited from foreign deals, begin plotting in secret. They try to stir division, spreading propaganda that unity is impossible. Narrator: the greatest danger was not always outside. Sometimes, it was within. Yet, the people remember those 135 minutes and they refuse to be divided again. Scene 18 at the turning point of the world. As years pass, other nations outside Africa begin noticing. South America joins Africa in trading resources in local currencies. Asian countries build new partnerships directly with African nations. Even citizens in Europe start questioning why Africa's move is called dangerous. Narrator: in freeing itself, Africa had planted a seed of global change. What began in 135 minutes was now echoing across the planet. Scene 19. The legacy. A decade later, schoolchildren sit in classrooms learning about that morning. Teacher: class, can anyone tell me what happened between 6:45 a.m. and 9:00 a.m. on that historic day? The children raise their hands eagerly. Narrator: emotional tone. For them, it was not just history, it was their inheritance. They grew up in a world where Africa was no longer begging, but leading. Closing scene. The message. The camera zooms out over the African continent at sunrise. Narrator: final words. 135 minutes. That's all it took, not to finish the struggle, but to begin it anew. And because of that morning, the world learned a lesson it will never forget. Africa is not the past, a broken bar. Africa is the future.